Well, thank you very much indeed. Sir, you said you were surprised to be here. Let me assure you, so am I. It's a great honor, not least because of the previous winners of this prize. And so I just ask you for a moment to imagine if you were standing here instead of me. If you're like me, your first and overwhelming thought would be, why me? I've had that thought rather often in my life because I've had a surprisingly successful life, but it didn't start that way. I was very much an ordinary boy from an unfashionable town in the north of England. Both my parents left school when they were only 12 years old. And my parents had absolutely no opportunity in life, and so just never had the chance to achieve what I've achieved. I was sitting here listening to that concert and thinking how much my mother would have adored it. I was listening to Sukai-chan and thinking how much my father would have enjoyed engaging with him in debate. My father was born Karl Hellenschmidt. He was the son of another Karl Hellenschmidt, who was born in a little village Ernstbach near Stuttgart, and was the classic 19th century migrant out of Germany. If you had some money, you went to America. If you had no money at all, you could only stagger across the channel. And he went to the richest city in Europe, Bradford. And so my parents were both a story of opportunity denied. The bottom billion in German is actually dedicated to, it says, to Karl Hellenschmidt, who taught me how to think. And despite having left school when he was only 12, that's just what Karl Hellenschmidt did. He taught me how to think. And what a tragedy it is that people like him were denied the education that could have turned that creative mind into structure that could have achieved what he was capable of. And that insight is what's given me the energy to concentrate on what I think of as a billion people who, like my father and mother, are trapped in situations that deny them opportunity. And in the 21st century, that is truly a tragedy, because it's avoidable. It's avoidable if we help these struggling societies to achieve what they're capable of. And why I have written my books to be accessible is that I realized that actually our policies at the moment have been pretty incompetent. It's not that they're badly intentioned, but they're badly designed. They're badly designed because our citizens are not well informed. In a democracy, it's therefore vital to try and build understanding amongst enough citizens that gives the space and the impetus for policy to be effective. So that was why I've tried not just to do research on these questions, but to express them in language that people can understand. Now, I'm particularly excited to be in Germany because Germany really, really matters. At the present time, there is actually only one successful major society in the world, and it's yours. And so you have an unavoidable role of leadership. It's also a very strategic time in Germany, since you're just going through the democratic process of forming a new government. And so it's a wonderful time for you to rethink. And so, please don't take offense at this, but what I'm going to do in the little time I've got is just look at each of my books. Each addresses a different problem and think, how can that apply to Germany? And we'll start with the bottom billion. The bottom billion was trying to explode the concept of developing countries. 6 billion people in poor countries, and us the lucky billion. Right? The bottom billion was a thesis that There's no such thing anymore as the developing world. There are a lot of countries that are emerging market economies that are doing pretty well, catching us up, and that's great. And there's 1 billion people living in 60 or so little countries that are not yet converging, that are not securely on a path of catching up. Many of them are falling behind, and some of them are falling apart. Indeed, I want to acknowledge that the opening sentence of the bottom billion, which is that the third world has shrunk to Africa, was not my insight. That comes from Ralph Dahrendorf. Ralph was the warden of my college, and I often enjoyed discussing with him over lunch, and that was a phrase that he came out with. So what's the message of the bottom billion and the implication for Germany? It's that our development policies better focus down on where the remaining problem is. There's 1 billion people living in 60 or so poor countries. They are where our development efforts should be devoted. The emerging market economies can now take care of themselves. They're doing well enough. They're catching up. Now, just one implication of that for Germany's aid program. At the moment, an awful lot of your aid goes to G20 countries. In other words, to emerging market economies. Rather more of it goes to the emerging market economies than goes to the bottom billion. That is a mistake. You can scale up your aid to the poorest countries that are still struggling, even without putting a lot more money into your development budget. Just move it. Right? British aid has done that over the last few years. The Ministry of Development, even before he became Minister of Development, picked up the bottom billion and said, that is what we're going to do. And they did. They did. British aid is now overwhelmingly concentrated on the poorest countries. That was a pretty tough political fight within bureaucracies. There were all the bureaucracies have lobbies to protect vested interests and keep doing things as they've been doing, as they've been happening. And so the lobbies came up with all sorts of arguments as why Britain should still be putting money into Brazil, still putting money into China, and so on and so forth. We've stopped. We've faced those lobbies down, and I hope you will. Let me turn from the bottom billion to the next book I did, Wars, Guns and Votes. The bottom billion was about poverty. Wars, Guns and Votes, Democracy in Dangerous Places was about power. And the very minimum of power is physical security of your own territory. And so, as you just said, a lot of the threats to security in Africa are external. A very good example of that was what happened in Mali. Mali was a functioning democracy. There are 3 lists of fragile states in the world, UN, OECD, World Bank. Mali wasn't on any of those lists, and quite rightly. Mali was a pretty secure democracy. What happened in Mali was a spillover from Libya. Gaddafi, in his last desperate moments, hired a load of mercenaries from elsewhere in Africa. He got a fabulous equipment of armory of military equipment, all the toys that an insane and wealthy dictator could buy. The mercenaries took the guns. They weren't much interested in defending him, but they knew what they wanted to do with these guns, and so 800 of them headed south for Mali. The West knew about that, but it sat on its hands. In Stuttgart, very near where my grandfather came from, Stuttgart is an army, AFRICOM, which is America's army devoted to the protection of Africa. So it's a dedicated army for Africa. And here was a situation par excellence where AFRICOM needed to fly in and protect Mali from these 800 heavily armed men. Instead, AFRICOM sat on its hands. It stayed in Stuttgart. These 800 men mowed down the Malian army en masse. And had not France flown in at the very last moment troops to defend the country, Mali would now be Somalia number 2. So that was not Germany's decision, but there was this army sitting in Stuttgart, dedicated to protect Africa and unused. Let me turn to the third book, The Plundered Planet. The Plundered Planet was about the management of natural resources. And this is enormously important because the commodity booms of the last decade led to a massive amount of discovery of natural resources in Africa. Africa was the last undiscovered, unexplored territory on Earth. And so over the last decade, resource extraction companies from around the world have descended on Africa and discovered stuff. The coming decade will be the decade of extraction. We've had the decade of discovery, it will now be the decade of extraction. Over the next decade, Africa's natural assets will be very rapidly depleted. They will be dug out of the ground by Western resource extraction companies. Western resource extraction companies doing that are a little bit analogous to banks. That is, they are the custodians of other people's assets. In this case, the resource extraction companies are the custodians of the most valuable assets that poor societies possess. We've learnt the hard way with banks that they need to be subject to a higher level of regulation than ordinary companies, precisely because they're the custodians of other people's money. We need to do exactly that same task with resource extraction companies. We need to build an international system of regulation to bring them up to standard. Otherwise, the resource discoveries in Africa will repeat the tragedies of the 1970s and 80s when resource extraction in Africa led not to development but to plunder. To my astonishment, Prime Minister David Cameron had read The Plundered Planet and was sufficiently impressed by it that this last year, when Britain hosted the G8, he asked me to set the development agenda for the G8. And so I used that opportunity to say, forget about the usual stuff at the G8. It's not about preaching to Africa about what Africa should do. It's not about pledging money which we don't have and pretending that by moving money from pot A to pot B, we're actually doing anything. Let's put our own house in order by starting to build a regulatory structure for the governance of natural resources. In the G8 agenda, there were 3 components to that. One was stop saying, do as I say. There was the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, launched by Britain, but Britain had never signed it, run by German, Peter Eigen, but Germany had never signed it. None of the G8 countries had signed up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. They were saying to Africa, you sign it, but of course not us. And so the first item that I tried to get on the G8 agenda was stop saying do as we say and start saying do as we do. And it worked. 5 G8 countries, including Germany, signed up to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. When I tell that to my African friends in government, they say straight away, I see, so that's now the new global standard. We better do it. Overnight, by Germany and 4 other G8 countries doing it, you've made a global standard. Right? Second component of the G8 that really mattered for extractives was complemented that, which was the legal requirement on extractive industries to report publicly their payments to governments. And that started with America doing the Cardin-Lugar Amendment. Again, at the G8, Europe committed to the same thing, and Canada committed to the same thing. So, major success. And then the third component was to make corruption in resource extraction much harder. The main thing I've been working on the last couple of years is helping an impoverished African government where, as far as we can see, a bribe of a few $1 million secured rights over resource extraction worth more than the country's entire annual GDP. And so that was lost to the country because of that bribe. How are those bribes channeled? They're channeled through things called shell companies. Shell companies are legal structures built by lawyers, typically in London and New York, and the essence of a shell company is the true ownership of the company cannot be detected. And then having set up your shell company, you open a bank account in the Cayman Isles or some other overseas territory, a secrecy haven, and your corrupt official who has squandered the country's rights to its natural resources for a few $1 million in his own pocket can put those few $1 million in a bank account and it's completely safe. There is nothing that an African government can do to detect that money and to punish that official. Nothing. And I've been working with a government that's in exactly that position. But although there's nothing that Africa can do about it, there's a lot we can do about it. We can make the true ownership, what's called the beneficial ownership of companies, transparent. It doesn't have to be public knowledge, but it does have to be something that governments know. We need government registers. To my astonishment, the British government, which is the epicenter of the problem, because that's where the lawyers are, and it's the British overseas territories where the bank accounts are, to my astonishment, thanks to the leadership of David Cameron, British government said, right, we will change policy. We will try and fix this problem, but not if we're alone, only if everybody does it. Right? And then we fought the fight through the G8. And we got to Enniskillen. I was there at the lunch with Chancellor Merkel, President Obama, etc. And what threatened to be the holdout, to my amazement, was Germany. Germany had some problems with whether it could go along with this. Thank goodness at the last minute, Chancellor Merkel said, surely we can do this. And so it went ahead. But I urge you, you shouldn't be the one dragging your feet on this. You should be the one pushing it forward. It's a miracle that Britain, with its powerful interests in the lawyers in London, in the bank accounts in its territories, it's a miracle that there's been policy movement there. And you need to be pushing that forward, not dragging your feet. And then finally, I've got a fourth book, just out this last week, Exodus, which is about migration. Now, Karl Helmschmidt, the guy who left Little Ernsbach for the bright lights and economic success of Bradford, was a sort of classic migrant before his time, leaving a poor village for a rich city. But actually, in retrospect, his migration didn't really help Germany. Germany caught up dramatically, but it didn't catch up because a lot of people, like my grandfather, left. It caught up because all of you people who'd stayed behind built a successful manufacturing. And that's the heart of the story today, that the emigration of the bright, the energetic, the young isn't necessarily a great thing for the people left behind. And so I don't see my grandfather as the role model for current-day migration. Rather, I'm going to suggest that the role model for current-day migration is Shu Kai-Chan. Because what Shu Kai-Chan did was come to Germany study. Go around the universities, pick up a mass of valuable experience, attitudes to work, all sorts of things that Germany offered and that China didn't offer at the time. And then what did he do with that knowledge? He took it back to China. And he made a difference in China. And that is the sort of migration that is hugely beneficial. We can show rigorously that when people from the poorest countries, from the bottom billion, come to countries like Germany, get education, and then return to their societies, they are hugely beneficial. Not only do they bring the skills that help to build opportunities for others, but they bring back the attitudes that lead to democratization and political reform. As I say, we can show that rigorously. And so the hot debate on migration that's in Germany and that's in many societies, it shouldn't be cast as the more migration the better, because that just helps the poor. It'd be nice to think that, but actually we've got to focus on what of our policies will enable the poorest societies to catch up. And the thing that we really need to scale up is not opening our doors to more permanent migrants, but opening our doors to more training and education. We need to be really generous in those policies. And that's why the A.SK might in the future think of a fellowship that actually brings somebody to Germany from the poorest societies, if I may be so bold. I've just come from Iowa, where there's several million people of German descent. And I suggested this at the University of Iowa. And a wistful look came over the dean's face. And he said, oh yes, 20 years ago, the University of Iowa was full of African students. We had a lot. And then the Cold War ended, and all the funding dried up. Because we were no longer in competition with Russia, we no longer needed to worry whether Africa was going to be pro-American or pro-Russian. So all the public funding dried up. And so now there are no Africans. Literally none. And that seems to be the pattern at the moment across Europe. Britain is hell-bent on controlling immigration extremely incompetently. And so it's put in a target ceiling on the number of immigrants coming in, and it's including students in that target, and the easiest way to hit the target is stop students coming. And that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing, both in Britain's interest. And why is it in Britain's interest, just as it's in Germany's interest? Well, look at Shu Ki-chan. Not only did he go back and be a success, but he was grateful for what Germany had done for him. And he expressed his gratitude quite dramatically. Right? And I'm very thankful for it. So, opening our doors to students and being generous about it is good for us. It builds long-term relations. But it's most important, it's good for the societies of the bottom billion. It's their struggle to catch up that we need never to lose sight of. So thank you very much.